We've already made mention of the Vietnam War when talking about the Eisenhower and Kennedy presidencies and the escalation involved. We didn't really discuss the escalation under Lyndon Johnson at the time of discussing domestic policy during his presidency because I knew that I wanted to save it for its own presentation. So today, the Vietnam War. Early involvement we've already discussed. The French lose at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 and withdraw. Eisenhower sends economic and military aid through the form of money and weapons to aid South Vietnam. This begins in 1954 after the French leave. President Kennedy sends advisors, which is really just military officers from the U.S. who would train the South Vietnamese and in many cases fight right alongside them. This began in 1961. By 1964, it's pretty clear that the South Vietnamese might very well fall to the Viet Cong, which are the communist guerrilla fighters sent into the South from North Vietnam. And so the concern is growing that the entire country may go communist. So again, to summarize, President Eisenhower sends money and weapons only. President Kennedy sends advisors, so this is the first U.S. military presence, although limited. By the time President Johnson is resoundingly reelected after having taken over for President Kennedy, he's resoundingly reelected in 1964, and he escalates to the point of large numbers of U.S. military troops being deployed to Vietnam. So U.S. troops, boots on the ground. Here's a political cartoon depicting the lunacy of escalation without really knowing what we were getting into. And a photo of President Johnson and his Secretary of Defense, who he had kept on from the Kennedy presidency, Bob McNamara. And the irony here is they are in a meeting about escalating Vietnam, and one of the other presidential figures who had also escalated Vietnam a little bit is President Kennedy, whose sculpture is in the background. The Gulf of Tonkin incident. President Johnson is informed in August of 1964 that the North Vietnamese had attacked U.S. ships with gunboats in the Gulf of Tonkin. Congress very swiftly signs the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, giving Johnson authority to use military force in Vietnam at his discretion. Johnson waited until after his re-election in November of 1964, and in 1965 sends American troops into Vietnam in gradually increasing numbers until their peak in 1968. Here's a photo of the North Vietnamese motor torpedo boat that had supposedly attacked the USS Maddox on the 2nd of August in 1964. That's on the left. You can see in the bottom right a map showing the movements of the USS Maddox. And then you can see President Johnson signing the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, giving him the power to fight the war in Vietnam at his own discretion. This is a controversial topic today because many declassified military documents show that the United States actually engaged the North Vietnamese ship and not vice versa. So really the United States started the conflict, not the North Vietnamese, but it was spun in a way to give President Johnson the authority to expand the war in Vietnam. So in 1965, U.S. boots are on the ground. In March, on the 8th, U.S. Marines land at Da Nang Air Base. Now, it's claiming that the Marines are just there to defend the air base, but eventually they are out in the field with the South Vietnamese fighting the communist insurgents. By November of 1965, an entire U.S. Army air cavalry units land in the Ia Drang Valley. The NVA nearly overruns them. There's a few thousand NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, and only 395 U.S. Army air cavalry soldiers. The victory at Ia Drang is only due to the superior weapons and technology via new helicopters of the U.S. Army troops. But General William Westmoreland claims an overwhelming victory and sees this superior weapons and technology advantage as the key to winning the war. Johnson, on Westmoreland's advice and Secretary of Defense Bob McNamara's advice, escalates the war. Here's a photo of U.S. Marines landing at Da Nang in March of 1965. Here's a photo of one of the helicopters landing in the Ia Drang Valley in November of 1965. The colonel in charge is Colonel Hal Moore. This is a photo of Hal Moore. This is a photo of Mel Gibson depicting Hal Moore in the movie We Were Soldiers. We Were Soldiers is based on Hal Moore's book, We Were Soldiers Once and Young. And then you could see here the 7th Cavalry's symbol, the yellow shield here. My grandfather was actually at the Ia Drang Valley in Vietnam and barely survived, and that being because of how drastically outnumbered the U.S. Army troops were. In 1965, the highest number of U.S. troops came to 184,000, but by 1968, Johnson had gradually escalated to the point of 536,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. Now, the Army was confident that the NVA and Viet Cong would not attack during what was known as a Tet holiday, a Lunar New Year celebration in Vietnam. However, they do attack, and the offensive comes as a complete surprise. Tet showed that the Communist strength was far more than the U.S. had assumed, and that the war would probably have to continue a whole lot longer. The people begin to turn against the war in Vietnam. You see here on the map in the upper left arrows that show movements into South Vietnam from North Vietnam, from Laos, and from Cambodia. I had already mentioned in my Kennedy presentation that President Kennedy had been very concerned about Ho Chi Minh Trail supply lines that ran through Cambodia and Laos. You can see here Cambodia and Laos, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail system is absolutely being used to the advantage of the Communists during the Tet Offensive. Perhaps one of the most famous images of the entire Vietnam War is a televised newscast in which South Vietnamese troops have captured a Communist insurgent, and they walk him down the street in front of a crowd of people and shoot him in the head. And he falls to the ground, absolutely dead from the shot to the head. But this is all seen on national television in the United States, and it only adds to the people's distaste for the war. Like I said, anti-war sentiments grow. There had already been people who disagreed with U.S. policy in Vietnam because the struggle was not our problem. This is not the United States' problem to deal with. However, the Tet Offensive convinces many, many more people that the war is not only unnecessary but also unwinnable, that the will of the North Vietnamese and of those dedicated to communism even within South Vietnam was too much to overcome even by the most powerful military in the world. Anti-war protests, marches, and actions increased significantly after Tet. Famous images to be seen here. Another famous image of the Vietnam War on the upper right is a photo of a student protester putting flowers into the barrels of military police troops guarding the Department of Defense building against the students protesting. A symbol of peace inserted into a symbol of war. On the bottom right, a controversial photo of actress Jane Fonda, who actually traveled to North Vietnam to try to express solidarity between the United States and North Vietnam, thinking maybe that she could reach out and help reach some kind of a settlement with them. This photo made it look as though Jane Fonda was actually supporting the communist cause, because you can see here she is in a military helmet and she is sitting on an anti-aircraft battery that was probably used at some point to have shot down U.S. planes. So very, very controversial. She is seen as a traitor by many people in the United States as a result. Eventually, a U.S. Senator from Massachusetts and the Secretary of State under President Obama, John Kerry, was a Vietnam veteran, and when he first returned to the United States from his service, he testified in front of Congress as to some of the horrific things that he saw while serving in Vietnam. Rape, murder, the burning of villages to the ground. He tells all of this to Congress, and he makes sure to do so in uniform to show the legitimacy of what he has to say because he was actually there. And perhaps one of the single most famous photos of protest against the war, Kent State University in 1971, there is a protest that turns bad. Protesters are throwing rocks at National Guard troops, and somehow National Guard troops fire into the crowd. And you can see here a female student absolutely horrified at the dead body of one of her friends from this protest. All of this turmoil, the Tet Offensive and the people turning against the war, leads President Johnson to decide in 1968 that he will not run for re-election. He announces to the public that spring that he will not seek, nor would he accept, the nomination of his party to be President of the United States. Very, very famous quote from a very, very famous speech. The next president elected is Richard Nixon, and Nixon focuses on a policy of striking up a Korean-style peace agreement with the communists. He refers to this as peace with honor throughout his presidential campaign. He also believes in Vietnamization, which really just means gradually pulling out U.S. troops while training South Vietnamese troops to take over the war effort on their own when we leave. Nixon expands bombing even into the neutral nations of Laos and Cambodia, where I already showed and mentioned that the Ho Chi Minh Trail system existed. Nixon's presidential portrait can be seen here on the left, meeting with his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, on the upper right. And on the lower right, you can see him speaking about the Ho Chi Minh Trail system that ran through Cambodia, through Laos, and allowed the North Vietnamese to sneak many, many, many supplies into South Vietnam to support their war effort. The Pentagon Papers, very famous incident where documents showing that the U.S. war effort was flawed were published in the New York Times. This was a publication of a Defense Department study on the war in Vietnam that was meant to remain classified, but a journalist by the name of Daniel Ginsburg got his hands on it, and in 1971, President Nixon had tried to prevent the document from being printed on the grounds of national security. However, the Supreme Court says, sorry, the New York Times has free speech rights and can publish these documents. So famous Supreme Court case, New York Times v. U.S. in 1971, where the New York Times gained the right to publish this Defense Department report. This report showed outright lies that the government had told in some cases concerning the war in Vietnam. You can see Daniel Ginsburg here giving an interview concerning the Pentagon Papers. The costs of the war. By the end of the Vietnam War, 58,000 Americans had died. Another 365,000 Americans were wounded. In 1973, when the U.S. finally reached a peace agreement with North Vietnam, 591 POWs were returned to the United States, which sounds good, except 1,350 Americans were still listed as either POWs or MIAs, missing in action, and roughly 1,200 Americans were reported as KIA, killed in action, body unrecovered. So this is a lot of devastation to U.S. society. People either had lost a family member or friend in Vietnam or knew a close family member or friend who had lost someone. You can see a chart of the total military deaths throughout the Vietnam War, a flag remembering prisoners of war and those missing in action, saying that you are not forgotten. And on the left, a famous image of a Vietnam veteran breaking down and crying at the sight of one of his old friends' names on the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C., in which every single casualty of the war has their name engraved into the wall. The War Powers Act of 1973. This after the abuse of power by President Johnson and President Nixon limited what a president was able to do with U.S. troops without the permission of Congress. This said that within 48 hours of sending U.S. troops into combat, the president had to inform Congress. It also said that U.S. troops could not be involved anywhere in the world for longer than 90 days without congressional approval. Today, President Bush and President Obama have both been criticized for abusing their presidential power in wartime. One of the biggest issues today that is seen as an abuse of power is the ordering of drone strikes by both President Bush and President Obama. At the tail end of President Bush's presidency is when drones became a new technology. He dabbled in them a little bit, and then President Obama has used them almost exclusively in targeting high-value terrorist targets. You can see a drone on the upper left firing 2 missiles. On the bottom left, a political cartoon. You can run, but you're only going to die tired, meaning that drones can sneak in. They're very quiet because they're electric motors, can sneak in and bomb and kill a high-value target very easily. On the bottom right is one of President Obama's top national security advisors. His name is John Brennan. And in the top right, Congressman, retired now, Ron Paul from Texas. Ron Paul spoke vehemently against President Bush and President Obama in their decisions concerning the war on terror. This is the end of the presentation. Please make sure that you go back and take the online quiz on the website. Use your notes. If you use your notes, there's really no reason why you can't get a perfect score. Thank you. See you in class.